GABRIEL ERNEST by Saki.
"There is a wild beast in your woods,"
said the artist Cunningham as he was being driven to the station. It was the only remark he had made during the drive, but as Van Cheele had talked incessantly, his companion's silence had not been noticeable.
"A stray fox or two, some resident weasels, nothing more formidable,"
said Van Cheele. The artist said nothing.
"What did you mean about a wild beast in my woods?"
said Van Cheele later when they were standing on the platform.
"Nothing. My imagination. Here is the train," said Cunningham.
That afternoon, Van Cheele went for one of his frequent rambles through his woodland property. He had a stuffed bittern in his study, and he knew the names of quite a number of wild flowers, so his aunt had possibly some justification in describing him as a great naturalist. At any rate, he was a great walker. It was his custom to take mental notes of everything he saw during his walks, not so much for the purpose of assisting contemporary science as to provide topics for conversation afterward. What Van Cheele saw on this particular afternoon was, however, something far removed from his ordinary range of experience. On a shelf of smooth stone overhanging a deep pool in the hollow of an oak coppice, a boy of about 16 lay asprawl, drying his wet brown limbs luxuriously in the sun. His wet hair, parted by a recent dive, lay close to his head, and his light brown eyes, so light that there was an almost tigerish gleam in them, were turned toward Van Cheele with a certain lazy watchfulness. It was an unexpected apparition, and Van Cheele found himself engaged in the novel process of thinking before he spoke. Where on earth could this wild-looking boy hail from? The miller's wife had lost a child some 2 months ago, supposed to have been swept away by the mill race, but that had been a mere baby, not a half-grown lad.
"What are you doing there?" he demanded.
"Obviously, sunning myself," replied the boy.
"Where do you live?"
"Here, in these woods."
"You can't live in the woods."
"They are very nice woods."
"But where do you sleep at night?"
"I don't sleep at night. That's my busiest time."
Van Cheele began to have an irritated feeling that he was grappling with a problem that was eluding him.
"What do you feed on?"
"Flesh,"
said the boy, and he pronounced the word with slow relish, as though he were tasting it.
"Flesh? What flesh?"
"Since it interests you, wildfowl, rabbits, hares, poultry, lambs in their season, children when I can get any, but they're usually too well locked in at night when I do most of my hunting. It's quite 2 months since I tasted child flesh."
Ignoring the chaffing nature of the last remark, Van Cheele tried to draw the boy out on the subject of possible poaching operations.
"You're talking rather through your hat when you speak of feeding on hares."
Considering that the boy was naked, the simile was hardly an apt one.
"Our hillside hares aren't easily caught."
"At night, I hunt on 4 feet,"
was the somewhat cryptic response.
I suppose you mean you hunt with a dog?" hazarded Van Cheele.
The boy rolled slowly over onto his back and laughed a weird, low laugh that was pleasantly like a chuckle and disagreeably like a snarl.
"I don't fancy any dog would be very anxious for my company, especially at night."
Van Cheele began to feel that there was something positively uncanny about the strange-eyed, strange-tongued youngster.
"I can't have you staying in these woods," he declared authoritatively.
"I fancy you'd rather have me here than in your house,"
said the boy. The prospect of this wild, nude animal in Van Cheele's primly ordered house was certainly an alarming one.
If you don't go, I shall have to make you.
The boy turned like a flash, plunged into the pool, and in a moment had flung his wet and glistening body halfway up the bank where Van Cheele was standing. In an otter, the movement would not have been remarkable. In a boy, Van Cheele found it sufficiently startling. His foot slipped as he made an involuntary backward movement, and he found himself almost prostrate on the slippery weed-grown bank, with those tigerish yellow eyes not very far from his own. Almost instinctively, he half raised his hand to his throat. The boy laughed again, a laugh in which the snarl had nearly driven out the chuckle, and then, with another of his astonishing lightning movements, plunged out of view into a yielding tangle of weed and fern.
What an extraordinary wild animal,
said Van Cheele as he picked himself up, and then he recalled Cunningham's remark. There is a wild beast in your woods. Walking slowly homeward, Van Cheele began to turn over in his mind various local occurrences which might be traceable to the existence of this astonishing young savage. Something had been thinning the game in the woods lately. Poultry had been missing from the farms, hares were growing unaccountably scarcer, and complaints had reached him of lambs being carried off bodily from the hills. Was it possible that this wild boy was really hunting the countryside in company with some clever poacher dog? He had spoken of hunting four-footed by night, but then again he had hinted strangely at no dog caring to come near him, especially at night. It was certainly puzzling. And then, as Van Cheele ran over in his mind the various depredations that had been committed during the last month or two, he came suddenly to a dead stop, alike in his walk and his speculations. The child, missing 2 months earlier. The accepted theory was that it had tumbled into the mill race and been swept away, but the mother had always declared that she had heard a shriek on the hill side of the house, in the opposite direction from the water. It was unthinkable, of course, but he wished that the boy had not made that uncanny remark about child flesh eaten 2 months ago. Such dreadful things should not be said even in fun. Van Cheele, contrary to his usual wont, did not feel disposed to be communicative about his discovery in the wood. His position as parish councillor and justice of the peace seemed somehow compromised by the fact that he was harboring a personality of such doubtful repute on his property. There was even a possibility that a heavy bill of damages for raided lambs and poultry might be laid at his door. At dinner that night, he was quite unusually silent.
"Where's your voice gone to?" asked his aunt. "One would think you had seen a wolf."
Van Cheele, who was not familiar with the old saying, thought the remark rather foolish. If he had seen a wolf on his property, his tongue would have been extraordinarily busy with the subject. At breakfast next morning, Van Cheele was conscious that his feeling of uneasiness regarding yesterday's episode had not totally disappeared, and he resolved to go by train to the neighboring cathedral town, hunt up Cunningham, and learn from him what he had really seen that had prompted the remark about the wild beast in the woods. With this resolution taken, his usual cheerfulness partially returned, and he hummed a bright little melody as he sauntered to the morning room for his customary cigarette. As he entered the room, the melody made way abruptly for a pious invocation. Gracefully asprawl on the ottoman, in an attitude of almost exaggerated repose, was the boy of the woods. He was drier than when Van Cheele had last seen him, but no other alteration was noticeable in his toilette.
"How dare you come here?"
"You told me I was not to stay in the woods."
"But not to come here? Supposing my aunt should see you."
And with a view to minimizing that catastrophe, Van Cheele hastily obscured as much of his unwelcome guest as possible under the folds of a Morning Post. At that moment, his aunt entered the room.
This is a poor boy who has lost his way and lost his memory. He doesn't know who he is or where he comes from.
explained Van Cheele desperately, glancing apprehensively at the waif's face to see whether he was going to add inconvenient candor to his other savage propensities. Miss Van Cheele was enormously interested.
Perhaps his underlinen is marked, she suggested.
He seems to have lost most of that, too,
said Van Cheele, making frantic little grabs at the Morning Post to keep it in its place. A naked, homeless child appealed to Miss Van Cheele as warmly as a stray kitten or derelict puppy would have done.
We must do all we can for him, she decided.
And in a very short time, a messenger was dispatched to the rectory and had returned with a suit of pantry clothes and the necessary accessories of shirt, shoes, collar, etc. Clothed, clean, and groomed, the boy lost none of his uncanniness in Van Cheele's eyes, but his aunt found him sweet.
We must call him something till we know who he really is, she said. Gabriel Ernest, I think. Those are nice, suitable names.
Van Cheele agreed, but he privately doubted whether they were being grafted onto a nice, suitable child. His misgivings were not diminished by the fact that his staid and elderly spaniel had bolted out of the house at the first incoming of the boy, and now obstinately remained shivering and yapping at the farther end of the orchard, while the canary, usually as vocally industrious as Van Cheele himself, had put itself on an allowance of frightened cheeps. More than ever, he was resolved to consult Cunningham without loss of time. As he drove off to the station, his aunt was arranging that Gabriel Ernest should help her to entertain the infant members of her Sunday school class at tea that afternoon. Cunningham was not at first disposed to be communicative.
My mother died of some brain trouble, he said, so you will understand why I am averse to dwelling on anything of an impossibly fantastic nature that I may see or think that I have seen.
But what did you see? Persisted Van Cheele.
What I thought I saw was something so extraordinary that no really sane man could dignify it with the credit of having actually happened. I was standing, the last evening that I was with you, half hidden in the hedge growth by the orchard gate, watching the dying glow of the sunset. Suddenly I became aware of a naked boy, a bather from some neighboring pool I took him to be, who was standing out on the bare hillside, also watching the sunset. His pose was so suggestive of some wild faun of pagan myth that I instantly wanted to engage him as a model, and in another moment I think I should have called to him. But just then the sun dipped out of view, and all the orange and pink slid out of the landscape, leaving it cold and grey. And at the same moment an astounding thing happened. The boy vanished too.
What? Vanished away into nothing?
No, that is the dreadful part of it. On the open hillside where the boy had been standing a second ago stood a large wolf, blackish in colour, with gleaming fangs and cruel yellow eyes. Now you may think, but Van Cheele did not stop for anything as futile as thought. Already he was tearing at top speed toward the station. He dismissed the idea of a telegram. Gabriel Ernest is a werewolf was a hopelessly inadequate effort at conveying the situation. His one hope was that he might reach home before sundown. The cab which he chartered at the other end of the railway journey bore him with what seemed exasperating slowness along the country roads, which were pink and mauve with the flush of the sinking sun. His aunt was putting away some unfinished jams and cake when he arrived. "Where is Gabriel Ernest?"
"He's taking the little Toop child home," said his aunt. "It was getting so late, I thought it wasn't safe to let it go back alone. What a lovely sunset, isn't it?"
But Van Cheele, although not oblivious of the glow in the western sky, did not stay to discuss its beauties. At a speed for which he was scarcely geared, he raced along the narrow lane that led to the home of the Toops. On one side ran the swift current of the mill stream, on the other rose the stretch of bare hillside. A dwindling rim of red sun showed still on the skyline, and the next turning must bring him in view of the ill-assorted couple he was pursuing. And then the color went suddenly out of things, and a gray light settled itself with a quick shiver over the landscape. Van Cheele heard a shrill wail of fear and stopped running. Nothing was ever seen again of the Toop child or Gabriel Ernest. But the latter's discarded garments were found lying in the road, so it was assumed that the child had fallen into the water and that the boy had stripped and jumped in a vain endeavor to save it. Van Cheele and some workmen who were nearby at the time testified at having heard a child scream loudly just near the spot where the clothes were found. Mrs. Toop, who had 11 other children, was decently bereaved to her loss. But Miss Van Cheele sincerely mourned her lost foundling. It was on her initiative that a memorial brass was put up in the parish church to Gabriel Ernest, an unknown boy who bravely sacrificed his life for another. Van Cheele gave way to his aunt in most things, but he flatly refused to subscribe to the Gabriel Ernest Memorial.